Today we'll be talking about political and crisis communication with Scott Ferson, founder, president, and CEO of the Liberty Square Group, a strategic communications and government relations firm headquartered in Boston, Massachusetts. It was founded in 1999, and it's grown since then into one of the top PR firms in New England. Scott, really welcome to you.
Thank you for having me. It's very nice to be with you.
Great. You know, Scott, I want to start out by just broadly talking about your experience in public relations. And your specialties, though, are political and crisis communication. First, would you tell us a little bit about your significant political work?
Sure. I really grew up in politics and loving it before I got to love the communications part of it. And for me, it started way back when on the John Anderson for President campaign in 1980, when I was still in high school and then in college. And then being from Massachusetts, my experience after that has been largely Democratic, exclusively Democratic politics. And I've done various things for various campaigns at different levels, but most significantly communications. I was Senator Ted Kennedy's press secretary in his Senate office in the 90s, and then in his subsequent campaigns. And in fact, handled the press during his funeral in 2009. So up until then, Joe Kennedy, the current congressman, has been a client. Stephen Lynch, who is a congressman for Boston, was elected on September 11th, 2001, and has been a client for a long time. And most recently, Seth Moulton, who was the only Democrat to defeat an incumbent of his own party in last year's election, and is I noticed yesterday was named one of the 50 most beautiful people in Washington by somebody.
Well, thank you so much then for spending the time with us. I mean, I knew a little bit about your background before we sit down today, but I think all of us are just really, really excited to learn about some of your experiences in that incredibly fascinating political communication background. But let's turn for a minute just to get an overview of crisis communication. In fact, could you share a situation and tell us how you handle crisis comm, since we're studying that this week?
Sure. I think crisis is particularly fascinating, and except for the circumstances that you find yourself in with your client or a situation you might work in, I find the pace and the fact that that largely unlike traditional PR, it's largely out of your control, the circumstances, and you're reacting as opposed to being able to plan. I just find exhilarating. And there have been, I mentioned Stephen Lynch being elected on 9/11. I mean, we came into election day, obviously not anticipating that events of the late morning and early afternoon originating in Boston would happen. And it completely changed the way we handled the way that we communicated his win that evening and the first few days after his election. But most recently, and I think this is something that everyone will be able to understand nationally or globally, was the marathon bombing situation. And the night of the bombing, actually, Congressman Lynch called me to say that a family from Dorchester who he knew had been affected and would probably need some PR help. And this was the Richard family in Dorchester, whose son Martin was killed and daughter Jane lost a leg. And in fact, both of the parents were severely injured. And so I went to the hospital early the next morning, knowing a couple of things that are unique to crisis communications. One was that they did not want PR. And in fact, weren't capable of even understanding or contemplating what had happened to them from a public perspective. They were very much, and still trying to deal with it just as a family unit. But what we knew as PR professionals was that the attention was going to be enormous and it had to be managed. And that if it wasn't, it was going to be a physical burden on the family, just how they operated, how they lived, how they moved around. So after a brief conversation with Martin's father, Bill, I worked with somebody who he felt very close with, a personal friend who was also in the business. And together we handled the mechanics. And what I find in crisis communication is that it's a situation that people largely would like to avoid. So the job is not even, the most important part of the job is not interfacing outwardly with the media or with other external audiences, but really with the client. and understanding that there are certain steps that need to be taken. And if you just listen to what the client's wishes were at that point, in this case, to be left alone, wasn't in the long-term best interest. So we did what we could, both internally with protecting them, and by doing that, by being that buffer between the family and the press. And that first day after we put out a press release at noon stating that Martin had died, putting out an official photograph from the family, I handled 176 incoming press inquiries that afternoon. And over the course of 2 weeks, we, I think, handled 2,000 press inquiries. And in fact, that first day, we dispatched a team to the Richards family home in Dorchester to create a buffer that the media largely respected. I shouldn't say largely respected. They weren't respecting it before we arrived. They were knocking on the front door and talking to neighbors. But we were able to set up some protections for the family that in the end proved, I think, extremely valuable for their ability to be able to concentrate on the things they needed to.
And I imagine that when they did eventually speak to the press, it was under their own terms and their own decision to do it. And you allowed that to happen.
Yeah, and I have to say this too, in the relationship with the people always say, and I've had friends in the media who said, this is just horrible, the fact that we feel like vultures and are prying into their, but I found them to be incredibly respectful in this situation. And as long as they were getting accurate information and they were getting enough information to be able to accurately report on it, they didn't go beyond that. And in fact, the family, it took them a year to the anniversary. It didn't take them a year. They chose to wait a year and fully tell Martin's story, and they were able to do that.
Right, right. Thank you so much for sharing that personal experience and how you handle it professionally with us. I think we might draw from that in the future, in other situations, of course. Scott, just to switch to a little something related, but more broadly related to public relations. You've told me in our past conversations that you believe, quote, successful communication focuses on what people hear and not what people say. Now I found that to be a very intriguing statement. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. And I think it's, comes out of my public, I think, first of all, in the public space, I think people have a different language, if you will, than you would in a business situation. And I found in consulting that businesses in the private sector, nonprofits, will hire people like me who have some public sector experience because we understand how people in the public sector process information and what they're hearing. But in the public space, particularly when you're selling, well, I guess when you're selling anything, you have to know what people are buying. And I think communications, for me, holds in that same way. I know what I want to say and what I want to say is important to me, but it might not be important to you. But if I understand what's important to you, you're going to receive what I'm saying in a lot more acceptably than otherwise. And the example I use is represented a tribe of Native American Indians who had been trying to get recognized in Massachusetts for decades, really. And it was a civil rights issue for them, and very strongly so. And they made the cases very passionately. But as a communications professional, I also understood that if you're trying a communication strategy for 30 years and it's not working, there may be something wrong with your communication strategy. And the thing that pulled out for me from what their story was that they were the tribe that met the Mayflower. That's not something that they would naturally use in their communications. That wasn't, frankly, an important thing for them anymore. But in Washington, if you're trying to be recognized and you're talking to elected officials, the fact that the federal government does not recognize the tribe that met the Mayflower is a whole different argument. And it's one that was easily more received in Washington. And in fact, they were the Mashpee-Wampanoag tribe, were the only tribe recognized nationally in the 8 years of the Bush administration. So that's what I mean in terms of you can have your message and it can be very strong and very personal for you. But if there's a call to action, if there's a goal in mind that that an elected official or the media or I control, it has to be something that makes sense to me.
I think that was brilliant. Thank you for sharing that with us. Uh, Now I want to turn to your use of social media. Of course, we're talking about that all the time now in communications. And you mentioned to me that the first time you used Twitter was to reach a large audience, or to reach a large audience, was for Senator Kennedy's funeral in 2009. And since that time, you've come to rely on Twitter for press notifications and I'm sure other things. Has that been true with you all along, or is that something that gradually you adapted? What's it like today? And what other social methods are you using, or how do you adapt quickly to new platforms? Because they're out there all the time. I know that was sort of a complex question, but social media.
Yeah, it's exactly. I think it's a fascinating question. I mean, I think there have been two revolutions. There's the steam locomotive that allowed us to go further than we could walk or ride a horse or go by wagon, and this revolution, which is just making communications so accessible and so fast, and not in a scary way. I think it's amazing what we as professionals are going to be able to do, and particularly young people coming into this business. I cannot imagine what it's going to be like 30 years from now. When my first day working for Ted Kennedy, I sat at my kitchen table and cut up physically with a pair of scissors the Boston Globe and drove to the Kennedy office in Boston and put it on a fax machine, and it came out in Washington, and somebody Xeroxed it onto real paper and put a paper clip on it and put it on his desk. And that's how Senator Kennedy read the Boston Globe in the morning. I tell that now. I should probably stop telling that to young people now. It's so old and ancient. And but normally with large scale Kennedy events, the time I worked for him and then after, you were dealing with lots of media and lots of Kennedys, and so the accuracy of the information depended on how many reporters I was able to talk with at any given moment while they were doing coverage of any event. With Senator Kennedy's funeral, we credentialed 450 press at the Kennedy Library for the wake and then for the funeral at Mission Hill, attended by the president. It was a lot of press to manage and a lot of moving parts. And I had heard of this thing called Twitter, and most of the media had not, and we all signed up. And we created a page, and I said, this will be the only way I will communicate with you about things. I will feed the beast. I will tell you as much information as possible, but not individually. So keep on this. This is the official account, and you can report on it. And I had this incredible moment now that again seems extremely mundane, but walked across the parking lot, and a friend stopped me to say, CNN reported you have 1,000 people online to wait to get into the library. And I had just put the tweet out about it, and 6 months before I didn't know what Twitter was. And so now we think about this in our lives. I was trying to reach Verizon to complain about my cell service, and they cut me off. And I pulled over to the side of the road and I tweeted at Verizon and immediately got a response from Verizon via Twitter if I had a problem and how could they help me. So in this business, to get a response that quickly is extremely powerful, and we employ it every day, all day long, not only for our clients, but also for commenting on things that are happening in politics, promoting the things that our clients are doing or our employees, and increasingly, if I'm pitching a client, I get asked about it. What is our social footprint presence, and how do we interact? How do we use it in our business?
Well, I think that's an excellent point to end our conversation. This is the first week of a very intense introduction to public relation practices course, and you've really set the bar high with, pay attention to all of the social media communication as we go through these weeks and how that can be harnessed. Are there any closing thoughts that you might have before we say goodbye?
No, but I guess for me, there's real power in what we're able to do for causes that we believe in and for businesses that we believe in. And particularly in the political space, and watching the presidential, I'm close enough in Massachusetts to keep a very close eye on New Hampshire. And I'm constantly amazed at how the coverage is so on the surface and so dealing with issues that are never going to be relevant when people come to vote, people who aren't going to be in the race any longer. And so always trying to make a deeper, if you can make a deeper connection with people, you really can break through and get to them. And not, we're doing a series of interviews now as part of a democracy project, and I'm always amazed that even people on the street that you talk to will sort of give you a soundbite, the answer they expect you to want. And yet these are the same people that hate it when any politician does that. And just being thoughtful and understanding how you get under whatever that surface question or answer might be can be really powerful. It's amazing how people will respond to that and stop and think. And then you're having just a deeper conversation, or understanding actually what they want and what they're looking for. And it's pretty neat.
Mm-hmm. Well, I couldn't have said it better. I want to thank you very much for helping us start out this course and sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.